Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our second panel speaker today, Dr. Jakki. She is an assistant professor here at UT Austin in the School of Information. Dr. Bailey specializes in emerging technology and its influence on cognition, behavior, and learning across different ages. She examines the psychological implications of emerging VR on child development and is currently studying VR's influence on children's cognitive skills and social responses. In addition to academic experience and service, Dr. Bailey has advised children's media company executives on the psychological, social, and ethical implications of VR in youth lives. Over to you.
Thank you for that warm introduction. It's great to be here. I'm glad that I have an opportunity to talk to all of you and present my research. And we'll have hopefully a conversation after my talk and think about your perspective and your interpretation of what I've had to hear to say and what you think we could see in the future for virtual reality and other immersive technologies. So today my talk, considering children's cognitive and social responses to virtual reality. Whenever I do my talk, I always like to start off with a little bit of a question for the audience. So to begin with, I'd like to ask with a raise of your hands, I want you to go back into your mind when you were, by the time you were 10 years old, and think about what types of tools or technologies you had experienced, you played with, or you had exposure to when you were, by the time you were 10. Show of hands, did you ever use a computer, a desktop computer by the time you were 10 years old? Okay, what about a laptop computer? The internet, a smartphone or a mobile phone. Video game consoles or video games.
Yes.
Television. All right, okay, I was like, yeah, let's go about that. Well, we're in an amazing age now where kids have had use of all of these things plus more. So we're now in an age of, oh, and a tablet, I forgot this last one, tablet. All right. We're in a new age of immersive and interactive technologies for children where they've had exposure or interaction with all of these types of technologies, or at least know about it. But now they're getting more accessible to more affordable, immersive, and interactive technologies. So for example, in 2015 in Sweden, McDonald's had a campaign where parents could bring their kids into McDonald's, buy a little meal, take that box that the meal came into and turn it into a virtuality headset. They put their phone in there, load up an app for McDonald's, and the kids could play a virtuality game with McDonald's content. We see the Viewmaster. So a long time ago, there used to be this little thing that you put in and click it and you'd see like a new little image. Now kids can put their parents' phone in there and have another virtuality experience. We see augmented reality at the tip of children's hands with a mobile and smartphone. We also have new interactive devices that really leverage artificial intelligence, such as smart speakers like Google Home or Siri. And now we're in a new age where Meta has revealed itself. Once Facebook, once Oculus, now they have a plan of putting everything together and creating a lifestyle or an experience where you can interact and do lots of different things you couldn't do before, but within these virtual and immersive environments. And so my research thinks about what are the implications of immersive technology in children's lives. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done to just start to answer this larger question. So what we'll talk about today is, I'm going to define what virtual reality is. There are a lot of definitions out there of what VR means, and I'm going to explain to you what it means to me when I refer to virtual reality. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how children's cognitive and social responses are to virtual reality based off of some research that I've conducted, as well as what are some of the spontaneous things that kids just do automatically and naturally when they're in these immersive environments. And then finally, discuss some things for us to consider for the future when we think about immersive and interactive technologies for children. All right, let's begin. What is virtual reality? I'm going to take you through a little history of virtual reality. You might think, Dr. Bailey, but I thought virtual reality only started when Oculus came out, or maybe when The Matrix came out on film, but there's a long history of virtual reality in the world. We could say virtual reality started in the 1940s, even when we think about flight simulators, how pilots would get in these physical constructions, have a giant screen of a film, and practice navigating through that. In a way, that was its own virtual reality. And then in the 1950s, we have this sensorama, where people would go to a penny arcade and go into this device where you'd see a little motion picture, and then smell would come flowing in your face. You feel some wind, some sound would play. And then when we move to the 1960s, we have this new development of virtual reality with the head-mounted display. And this was created by Ivan Sutherland. And this is where he had this huge device that was so heavy because of the computing power of this time during the 60s. It was hanging from the ceiling, and there's two little screens that you could look through. You could see just a line character of a virtual environment. And this is kind of the opening stage of what we think of what modern VR headsets look today. So now I go back to the beginning of what is virtual reality and what do I mean when I describe virtual reality? Well, virtual reality can be described just as a technology, but it's more than that. It's a combination of technological experience combined with people's psychological, subjective, and personal experience as well. So if we just think about virtual reality as a technology, what is it? Virtual reality is a computing system that has tracking, rendering, and a display. So what that really means is the system tracks a person's movements and behaviors, renders or updates the virtual environment based off of that, and then displays that information in many different ways. So for example, if we made a virtual environment of this room right here, I have a virtual reality headset on, I'm looking through two screens, and I take a step forward. The system tracks me moving forward in space. Then it updates the screen where everything is drawn a little bit bigger and renders it that way, and then displays that information in the headset, giving me the illusion that objects are closer to me. And displays don't just have to be visual, they can also be multi-sensory. So if there was a dog in the corner barking really loudly and I took a step forward, the system would update off that information and make the sound of the dog barking a little bit louder. So that's what we can say when I'm talking about virtual reality. I'm going to talk about using a head-mounted display or VR headset that covers the eyes. It's like wearing goggles, blocks out the sensory information of the outside world, a system that tracks and renders the user's information and displays it. But virtuality can also be defined in terms of an experience. So when we think about virtuality experience, there's a term in VR research called presence. So it's the idea of a simulated environment experienced as real in sensory and non-sensory ways. And so Lombard and Dighton have a great definition of presence or experiencing a VR environment is real as non-mediation between you and your experience. So the idea is I put this headset on, I really feel like I'm really there. I don't even pay attention to the fact that I'm wearing this headset. That's how we can also think about VR. It's the psychological, subjective experience of our environment that feels real. But what does that look like when we put them together? So what does it look like, the technology and the experience coming together to make this idea of what virtual reality is? I'm going to show you a little bit of a video clip for that. This is Anna. In this video, Anna is 5 years old. She's wearing a head-mounted display. So she has that on, that's the technology. It's blocking out the physical world. She can move, the world interact and responds as she moves around. And then she's in a virtual space. That's a room that looks just like the room that she's in. But in that virtual room, there's a big blue fluffy Muppet. So she's in there with him. So I'm going to show this video. So what did we see here? What did anybody say? What did you see? What did you see happening here?
Shock.
How do we know that?
From her response.
Oh, yeah, she jumped.
She jumped, yeah.
She jumped?
Yeah.
That's right. We saw a little bit of a twitch action. She paused. We saw her wave. She said, hello. Grover, who's the Muppet, said, oh, come and dance with me. And she danced with him. So we're seeing these things come together where We have the technology that's replacing her physical world stimuli with artificial stimuli, but the important part is she feels that it's real and she's responding to it as if it is real. And that is how we can think about virtual reality as the psychological experience, also this technological immersion coming together. And there's a lot of research about why the technology is so important. And we define VR and we define people's experiences. So there was a meta-analysis by Belling and Cummings that found that the more technological features that a computing system had, the more the virtual environment felt real. And they specifically found that stereoscopic vision and systems that had many levels of tracking and a wide field of view were really important. And so when they meant many levels of tracking, it really was related to being able to physically interact with the environment effectively and synchronously. So if you move forward, it moves. You can do translation, and you can also do orientation as well. And then importantly, they found that virtual reality experiences could influence behaviors, attitudes, and perceptions. And so we've seen studies where virtual reality, if you embody a child in virtual reality, you perceive objects to be larger than if you embodied a virtual character that was just the size of a 4-year-old. It can change your behaviors, such as environmental behaviors, using less paper. It can change your attitudes, such as reducing racial bias. So the technological features of VR makes the environment feel real, and it can also change behaviors, attitudes, and perceptions. But I talked about virtual reality in general, and today I'm focusing on kids. But what do we know about VR studies with kids right now? What is the literature saying? What research has been done? So in general, there's a lot of work on virtual reality use as a pain distraction tool. It's extremely effective at reducing emotional anxiety and the perception of physical pain for children. There's a lot of work in the education space that still is unclear about how it specifically relates to specific learning outcomes, but there's a lot of value in this. So there's a lot of opportunity. At a minimum, we know that VR is really good in terms of self-efficacy, motivating kids, having them enjoy the experience of learning. And then it's also used as an assessment tool, such as using it to identify and diagnose children with ADHD by using virtual reality and putting it in a more validated environment, like a classroom environment, as opposed to just a questionnaire kind of determining what their status is. And then there's this little bitty category that's growing that's looking at the developmental effects. So what does it mean to be a person, develop different skills, and how do those specific skills relate to your experience of virtual reality? And this is an area that I'm really interested in, particularly now when we see how more available it is for kids and youth, and thinking about those abilities and skills that you develop over time. How does that affect how you interact with these technologies? Right, so now I'm going to talk about cognitive and social responses specifically. So when I started doing this work, I was really fascinated by early childhood. So I'd been reading some research about, again, virtual reality being really effective as a pain distraction tool. They've used it for kids as young as 4 years of age for dental appointments, for example, for chemotherapy. And I'm just wondering about the specific early childhood. It's a time, when I say early childhood, around preschool years, 3 to 5 years of age. It's a time where kids are developing more mature, higher cognitive abilities, such as inhibitory control. It's also a time where they're beginning to get a firmer understanding of symbolic representation, understanding that something is a symbol. Still not quite as an adult, but they're starting to grapple with that. And they're starting to get a more mature understanding of the distinction between fantasy and reality. Virtual reality can influence kids' psychological responses because it creates these very perceptual and real experiences that makes the content and the objects in it very salient, and it can impact their attention and behavior. And so I did a research study to test this idea of how the perceptual realism of a system like this could influence kids' abilities and their social behaviors. So I started with inhibitory control. Inhibitory control is related to a suite of skills called executive function. And inhibitory control is the ability to regulate your emotions and your behaviors. So resisting temptation, suppressing an impulse, that could be keeping a secret, or not looking at an object that's moving really far away, that's a distraction, not reaching for something. And then this is developing with kids in early childhood. And it particularly relates to how salient an object is. Stephanie Carlson, a developmental psychologist, did a project where she gave kids the opportunity to get candy. Ooh, a very exciting, tempting thing. And kids had to resist pointing at a pile of candy, a large pile of candy. And if they didn't point at it, they would get that large pile of candy. And she found for the 3 to 5-year-olds, it was a challenging task for them to do. But when she made it look more abstract, it was easier for them to resist pointing at the candy. So she'd represent the candy as rocks or dots or as an animal. And so what this tells us that kids have a really hard time resisting things that are very salient and tempting. So for example, we have this lovely bowl of cookies for this girl right here. And if we wanted to make it easier for her to resist those cookies, we represent them as buttons. And then I also was thinking about social realism and how the influence of embodied agents could affect how kids behave as well. And generally the research shows that adults particularly, we have a lot of research on that, treats embodied agents in VR as if they're real people, as actual actors. And this has a lot of potential for kids as well. So Claxton and Ponto did a project study where kids saw an interactive character on a TV screen that talked and blinked and had natural movements, and then a live speaker here. And they had to do a decision-making task where a sticker was placed in one of those two boxes. They turn around, the researcher would put the sticker in, they'd turn back around, and they'd hear where the object was from the two people here. So the interactive character might say, I think the sticker's in the blue box. And the live person might say, oh, I think it's in the red box. And children had to decide where they thought the sticker was. And they never got feedback, so they never knew if they were right or wrong. And this was done with 5, 7, and 9-year-olds. 7 and 9-year-olds were very good about using the information from the live character and picking the same box that they did. The 5-year-olds was pretty much split between the two. They took the advice from the character, they took the advice from the live person. And the 5-year-olds were significantly more likely to say that they thought the interactive person could actually see them. So this is showing us that these interactive characters can influence children's behaviors and decision making, and that they use them as a source of information. So I did a project to look at kids' inhibitory controls and social behaviors and how that relates to their experiences in VR. So children played a game in with a character, Grover from Sesame Street. They played that game either via a Virtuality headset, or they played that same game via a television screen. So they played the game of Simon Says. So they did a pre-test where I measured their emotional and physical distress. They did a social compliance task. They did an inhibitory control task, and then a post-task test that just got their emotional distress, their physical distress, and their enjoyment, and then their sharing behaviors. So the social compliance task. In the virtual environment, Grover appears and he goes, hello, it's me, your lovable friend, Grover. Come over here, come closer to me. And I measured if kids walked closer to him, either in the VR condition or the television condition. And then they played a game of Simon Says. Who has played Simon Says? Simon Says, put your hand down. You've all got it. So you might not have realized that Simon Says is an inhibitory control task. And so the task is looking at your ability to suppress a motor action given the right time. So we want to imitate people. We want to do that dominant reaction, but we have to stop ourselves when we don't hear Simon Says. And then at the end, kids got out of the virtual reality experience and I gave them 10 stickers and I said, these stickers are for you. And I said, oh, also Grover's collecting stickers. If you'd like to give him some, you can put them right here. You don't have to give him at all. These are your stickers. And I measured how many stickers that they gave Grover. And then again, I measured if kids were afraid, sad, worried at the time, before and after. And physical distress was simulator sickness related questions such as, pain in their stomach, their head, their eyes, and any dizziness they might feel. So what happened? What happened when kids are playing Simon Says with Grover? Grover's saying, come over here, come closer to me. They have stickers they could keep or they could share. What happened when kids had this experience in VR compared to television? Well, we did see some differences in inhibitory control tasks. Kids had a harder time not imitating Grover in VR than television. So they would have a hard time not doing the action when Simon Says wasn't reported. And then there are differences in who approached Grover. So kids in VR, there are more kids, there was a higher rate of kids that approached Grover in the VR condition compared to the television condition. And then hearing was kind of an interesting result. Again, this was with 4 to 6 year olds. And this is a time when they're still developing equitable sharing. So some kids are just like, no, I don't want to share. But among the kids that shared, it's approximately about half of them, those that shared, the ones in the VR condition shared more than the ones that did not. And there were no differences in terms of how kids enjoyed the experience. There was no difference in terms of any type of distress that they had after the experience compared to the first experience. So what does this mean? What are the design implications of this work about kids' cognitive development and their social responses? Well, it gives us a clue that there are differences in how kids behave and interpret content based off of the platform that they're in. And that when they're still developing some of these cognitive skills, they might have a little bit of trouble, for example, not imitating something that they see in live, real time. So we have to think about what kind of experiences, what kind of learning experiences, what do we want kids to be able to imitate or not imitate in these environments. And then at the end, I was taking some notes, through each child that came, we took some observational notes. And these are some of the informal observations that we found. So in VR, kids would say a lot of things like surprise, like, whoa, or speak to Grover and say, do you see me? Well, that's weird. Hi, Grover. He looks kind of big. Ah! But compared to TV, they would say, I see Grover. I can hear him. Or when Grover would ask, come here, come closer to me, kids would just kind of look around and say, what should I do? Or they would just say, oh, and just smile and point at the TV. And seeing this, I noticed that kids would talk directly to Grover in the VR condition, whereas the TV condition, it appears that they talk about him. So again, we're seeing this interaction where they feel that it implies that this character is really there. And this inspired another project to say, what actually are kids just doing spontaneously when they're in VR? And they're in VR with these embodied characters, which they're really likely to see in any type of content that they do in the future in VR. What do they just want to do? So this research study was looking at the different types of responses that kids have to a variety of different characters. So before we just saw Grover the Muppet. So children were in VR. This was just a within participant study. Kids either saw a child character, a common character that you would see in kids media. And the child character was chosen 1 out of 13 possible models. So we always picked the one that looked the closest to the child. So every kid saw kind of a personalized child character. They all had the same outfit. Or they interacted with a giraffe, or they interacted with Grover again, the Muppet. And these 3 characters were selected based off of some previous research with television about how kids will pay more attention to the screen if there's a child, if there's an animal, or if there's a Muppet. And I was thinking, there's one thing to see a character on a screen, like an animal or this anthropomorphized creature, but it has to be something, it could be something entirely different if you see like they're right there, they feel like you're sharing the same space. So this is just to kind of investigate what they were doing spontaneously. And we did a lot of coding, and these are the behaviors that we found that kids did most often. So 88% of the sample of children attempted to touch or go inside the character. We see several of them trying to do that with the giraffe and Grover as well. 64% of them attempted to enter. First, it was just touching, like they're reaching out or trying to grab or clap or move their hands around. The second most common one was them attempting to enter the character. Some kids even responded about how they tried to become the character. And so they would say things like, I'm in his belly, or I'm inside his nose. So kids were really excited and delighted to actually try to get inside these characters once they figured out that they could actually do it. Because we turned the physics off of all these 3D models. So kids could do things that they couldn't actually do in the physical world. And then we also had a small group of kids who actually spoke to the characters. And so they would say things like, hello, hi, or they'd greet the different characters that they saw. And then finally, there's a small number of kids that were commenting on themselves represented in the virtual environment. So kids would say things like, I'm invisible. The way we set up the environment is we did not render a physical body. So the world responded based off of their movements, but then you look down, you don't see anything. And kids really commented on that. They would say, I'm invisible. Whoa, I can't see myself. Or they would say, I'm a ghost. And for this project, we only got what they vocalized, but oftentimes when we do these studies, we'll have kids go like this in front of the HMD, even though their eyes aren't exposed, they'll like look at their hands or try to see what's going on there. Or they'll take the HMD off and look around and then put it back on. So what are some implications about some of these spontaneous behaviors that kids engage in? Well, it lets us know that VR could be a system that's really good for just taking advantage of kids' natural inclination to explore things and go inside and discover things. So it'd be a great tool for scientific learning. It can also be used as something to understand social boundaries. So kids walked right through these things. They just did not care about social boundaries. So it could be an opportunity to either one, understand how kids think about social boundaries in a space like this, or help us understand social boundaries in general. And this will be really important, particularly as we start going out into the world and kids be engaging with live people out in the world in virtual environments, whether we want that or not, and understanding that it feels really real. What does it mean to have, what do these social boundaries mean? Can you violate them in the same way that you would normally violate them in the physical world? And then finally, avatar representation may be something to consider. Kids notice when they can't see themselves. Maybe further research on what identity means in VR for kids. What does it mean for youth? Particularly when we start moving towards an older age range, we think about how social cognition or the ability to understand social information and identity are really important as kids age. So I talked a lot about what virtual reality is, what the research has done in the past with kids in VR, a couple areas to think about in terms of social behaviors and cognition, as well as kids' spontaneous behaviors in VR. But now I want us to take a moment and think about the future. What can we think about for VR in the future? What are some additional topics to consider as we move forward? So the opportunity for learning, as I mentioned, discovery, virtual field trips. And I had a real life moment with this a few years ago. So this image over here on the side is a panel about learning environments and immersive technologies. That avatar you see in the back, that's me. I have a HMD headset on. I'm in Austin, Texas, joining this panel talking about the idea of virtuality in the classroom. And everybody here in this picture is in Dubai. Because I could not go to Dubai from Austin and turn right back around and teach my class. So we did kind of a proof of concept here where I joined the panel from Austin, woke up early in the morning, and we had a dynamic conversation with the audience, with the panel members, while I was in alt space VR, being able to move and talk with my avatar. Another topic area is just thinking about the affordances of technology. So not just virtual reality specifically, but other types of immersive and interactive technologies such as AR versus VR. So it could be the case that augmented reality is a really great tool for kids in terms of like collaboration and talking and being dynamic in their environment. But maybe we want to think about technology that blocks out the physical world like VR, and that might be more important, particularly in a medical field for kids where they can't necessarily see the doctor working on wound care. So it will be important to think about what do these specific technologies afford? What do the technologies allow kids to do for specific experiences? When is it important to utilize them? Because they're not a one size fits all type of tech. And then importantly, thinking about ethics and accessibility, thinking about, again, when is it important, when is it appropriate to introduce VR and immersive technologies in kids' lives? Thinking about who has access to them, how can we create features that people of different abilities can utilize VR? So when I think of VR, I don't necessarily only think about it as a VR headset. As I mentioned before, it's tracking, rendering, and display. So for someone who's blind or someone who has visual impairments, they can still have a virtual experience that maybe relies more on sound or touch and haptics. So again, thinking about the larger idea of VR and thinking about ethics as well. And then finally, thinking about all these different topics within the larger idea of communities and how different cultures, different age ranges, thinking about these different types of groups and when this technology could be helpful and when this technology could be harmful, thinking about what content we utilize here and how that can help or harm different communities as well. So we're moving again forward in this age of virtual reality, interactive technologies and children. And it's exciting and also a little bit scary at the same time. But I think if we keep thinking about these questions and go about looking at these technologies and how it relates to human development, we can really develop and design a really great and exciting future. And I look forward to being part of that. And I look forward to all of you being part of that and hearing your thoughts about these types of technologies in the future. And thank you very much. I'm Jakki. This is my email address.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm really here. This is not good. So I'll open the floor to questions. Do we have, who's the brave person with a first question? Yes.
Thanks, Jakki. That was wonderful. I'm curious what's your feelings in terms of the age range that Meta have established, that that 13-year-old boundary and the idea of mitigating adverse effects and being able to kind of choose. I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yes, I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different companies about this, and the internet is the wild, wild west. And so I think it's a complicated issue. And I think 13 in some ways is more mature in terms of fantasy and reality distinctions, but that age is extremely sensitive to social information like exclusion, as we've seen with social networking websites. And so while they allow this age range to have access to it, I still think it's not necessarily considered, they're not considered adults at that point, and something has to be put in effect in that way, even though it's really hard in their company. And then as I do these projects, the more and more I do these projects, kids come in and say, oh, I've done this before. Oh, I've used that, I know what that is. And it's always interesting when I think about that example with the Viewmaster, where it's specifically labeled 7 and up. And my question is like, why is that VR okay, but not the other type of VR? And I think there's always this debate about how much movement can be involved. Can they take it off easily and quickly? So I think these are other things people need to consider as well. Thanks.
Another funny thing, just to add on to this, is that we don't tell kids, don't go into the world till you're 13. You know what I mean? And the chance of them being, deformed by reality is par for the course.
I just brought it up because I've got nieces and nephews who are all under 13, and my dad is obsessed with virtual reality. So they're like, as soon as they come around to his house, it's like, where's the device? Where's the device? Yeah. Nothing's stopping them. They're diving headfirst into it. So,
but we do have PG-13 movies and R-rated movies, right? Yeah. So there is a difference between reality and virtual reality.
There is a difference because we are aware of what can happen if you send out a kid in the world. You don't send out a 5-year-old unsupervised into the world because there are people out there that may not have their best interests in mind, or things might be manipulated, or they could be confronted with things that they really shouldn't be confronted with. And I think that's why because a virtual reality world has more dangers of for all of that to happen. People that don't have the best interest, things that are manipulated, content that is graphic, so I think there is a difference between still a virtual reality and a reality as in who controls it, what they're seeing.
Exactly. It's a content issue and then also a people access issue of like, is it just self-contained? How long are they doing it for? Who are they interacting with? And I always say 30 minutes or less is always what you need to think about. And for younger kids, I even do less than that. Just even for just physical reactions too as well. Yeah, so it is like out in the world. Yes.
I don't know if this is virtual reality, but you know about there's a children's, well, it's not children's game, Fortnite. And is that virtual reality? Because it renders and you experience it. So I'm just wondering, is that a game that's considered virtual reality? Because it seems like it is.
Yeah, so I was maybe getting in trouble with this, but I think it's low-grade VR. And again, I think VR it's about the technological features. So you can have VR systems that don't let you walk, you can only rotate around. There's things like caves where you're like surrounded by screens, but you can still see your body. So I think it is a low-grade VR. It's a virtual environment for definitely, and it's low-grade VR. Again, it's just which technological features are added. And the more you add in there, the realer it feels. So if they're in Fortnite and everything else is blacked out in their physical world and they're in there, that is a highly immersive, lots of technological immersion for that type of VR. Because I always say, think about it that way, because in the future, VR is going to be something we don't even know what it is now. So if we define it based off of how immersive or what features are present, I think that allows it to grow as technology grows.
Yeah, I have a question about the thoughts about content access and sort of like, these groups. And so I'm just basically wondering, as being fully from outside of this expertise, what kinds of studies exist to contrast that kind of like unwanted or undesirable experiences that kids have and the effects on them, say like real world. It's like, oh, we didn't mean for you to see a car crash, but you did. And then people study it, right? And versus VR, like our exposures that for most of those we would go like, oh, you shouldn't have VR'd that, but then they did. So I'm wondering like where the field is at with contrasting those two different kinds of unwanted exposure according to adult parameters and where that's at, yeah.
Yes, that's a very challenging thing to do because no one wants to traumatize anyone on purpose. Not that that's the goal, but you have to be very, very careful. So even for me, I go through this very long debate. Like the fact that we picked a giraffe was like 2 days of talking about what animal would make the most sense because all the characters are scaled to be the same size as them. The way people have been touching on that a little bit is about like memory and being able to understand if it's real or not. And there's more work, especially now, not so much with kids, but looking about people's experience and like sexual harassment and kind of these VR spaces that are out there. There is a way to do this because they do this with television, but I don't think they've quite done that yet where I know there's lots of work about how kids will see like negative content and how that affects how they believe something is real or not. But I think that is still a place we're still trying to figure out how to do that ethically and to get good information about that.
Thank you, appreciate that.
I have a question. Just thinking also about the long-term effects of this and just wondering how long these studies, because I guess at this point, it's just short-term use of these tools, right? And I'm wondering, especially in terms of like pain and things like that, what you think might be implications, because in some ways, there is something to be said for actually learning how to manage pain and how to actually deal with it, that you then, those are lessons that you take into life, right? And what does it mean then for us to then distract kids from that? And so I'm just trying to think like what the long-term effects of these kinds of tools might be, right? And so just, yeah, what you might think about.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So what I hear you saying is touching on a couple different things. I might work a little bit backwards here.
Sure.
So one thing is you're looking at kind of a skill set and a practice and an ability to do things. And VR has been used for kids with autism spectrum disorder in terms of practicing social skills in a low stakes environment where they don't get the social exclusion if they try to practice these skills out in the world first. So they actually can practice, mess up a bunch of times, feel more confident, and then go out into the world. But there is something about if you practice a skill over and over again, especially in a fully embodied way, it does make you wonder, what does that mean for once kids remove that and have to interact in this other physical world, physical reality? But most of the pain distraction studies are for like chemotherapy or wound care, where kids do not want to see. It's better that kids don't see this. It helps them relax, helps the doctors be more effective. And there's some work in terms of the mental health space where, again, it allows kids to practice skills and abilities. Or if you're really amped up, it could be helpful in terms of like bringing your emotional level down. So then you can practice other skills. Because sometimes if you're so elevated, it stops you to be able to take more information or to learn information. So it could be used that way. But I know what you're saying, because it's also the question about a smartphone, how people can't wait in line anymore without looking at their phone because it's uncomfortable. So, I mean, that's something to consider.
One thing we saw in response to COVID was the obvious technical gaps when children were told to teach our kids at home online learning. And we suddenly discovered a whole swathes of children who don't have internet access at home, who don't have access to a computer, and are placed at disadvantage. So I'm wondering how do you ensure that this technology is accessible to all children, not just to the privileged?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is there a way to?
Well, the question is, who's your user group? Where are they going to be doing these things, and what do they have access to? So we have mobile phone VR. A lot of people now, not everyone, has access to some sort of like mobile smartphone device that you could turn into a VR headset. Also, augmented reality is another type of technology that is really phone-based right now that can provide a lot of different types of virtual experiences for kids that allows them to learn about the world around them as well. But that is a really important question, and it's a really important thing to consider. And I guess it also depends on how the technology changes and how popular it becomes and how the cost goes down. I remember when I first started during my PhD, the HMD that we had cost $40,000. So no one wanted to drop that at all. The tracking system itself was $100,000. And then, you know, in the short span of less than 10 years, the price has gone down. And I tell people now, you can get in some cases, at some point in time, a VR headset was cheaper than getting an iPad. But it's still expensive for a lot of people. So the price is continuing to go down. But I think the question becomes, okay, you have these devices you have access to, maybe mobile phone VR. How can we develop content that gets at what we want, but has limitations in terms of tracking? But what can we do in a smart way to do it?
Thank you. This is really great. I'm very curious about, Meta and Google and Apple releasing their smart glasses in the next couple years and what that will mean, because we won't just be like looking at our phone in a line, we will be constantly looking through smart glasses. And if they're designed well, the adoption will probably be fast, mainstream adoption. And so I'm very curious how this will work with a moment you talked about and the larger implications. And the moment was when the kids moved from a second person address or a third person address. So Grover is a he off here, or Grover is a you, right? And so it occurs to me that when we have smart glasses on all the time, that there's going to be this cognitive shift that is going to make not just kids, but also adults start to interact in these weird ways, right? Where it's them, they are there, and suddenly I can have a layer of reality that makes something interactive. So anyway, I'm wondering what the implications might be for smart glasses with kids growing up with that technology, and also what this might mean for other areas of research like empathy, teaching empathy, or skills of building communities.
Yeah, that is, the first thing that comes to mind is changing of social norms. And even going back to this other question about who has access to it, I think it'll be very, especially in the beginning, contained to kind of areas that have a lot of this. So again, like now, I still have trouble with this though. Like I can't tell if someone's on their phone or they're just talking to themselves because they have earpods on. So I'm always like, I don't know. And you try to talk to someone and then they're just totally not listening to you because they have that on. And so I'd just be curious about how do people navigate being able to still connect with other human beings while also looking at something? You know, what does it mean to have a spontaneous reaction with somebody? Is it going to be harder to have those types of, you know, instant connections with someone in a way? Or maybe it helps. I am blanking on his last, like his name's Thad. I want to say Warner, but I don't think that's his last name. In the early 90s, he basically made himself a cyborg, and he created a small screen that he had on one eye, and then he had it connected to the internet, and he had like a keyboard that he'd hold in his pocket. And so when he'd meet people, he would type in things and like look things up about people as he was talking to them. And for him, it really helped him with like connecting with people and socializing and coming up with conversation pieces. And so he thought it was just a really great thing. And you know, maybe for some people it helps, but I'd just be curious about just things like that at a minimum. And you know, even kids or teenagers, what does it mean to just, you know, have a spontaneous conversation with someone? Do you need to look them up first before you do that? I mean, people do that with dating now, with Googling. So I don't know what that means if you're just meeting someone at a coffee shop in line.
Thank you. Different kind of surveillance.
Yes, that's the part that concerns me is unwanted photographs and videos. They're definitely going to need something that makes it very apparent that you are now being filmed. At least with phones, you can kind of see when someone's doing something. That was one thing that people really hated about Google Glass was you know, people could take pictures just publicly.
I was wondering, there probably has been, but have you come across the research of, you know, with the use of virtual reality and putting kids into this space? I think the medical implications are fantastic. I think it's wonderful, but just on an average child who doesn't have any, you know, need for that, if they're immersed in this world at a young age, what's that going to do to their kind of social and behavioral aspects? Because I feel like even with the advent of just the cell phone and, you know, the like Fortnite and the certain video games, they have this sort of tunnel vision, and then they're put into a social room like we're in here, and they don't really know how to express themselves or how to interact with each other. And they're like, we're kind of walking back on those social skills. Have you found that this could be like helpful or a hindrance to that?
I don't know if anyone's done that at a large scale yet and over time. Like, as you were mentioning before, it's been used a lot in kind of the mental health and health areas as well. But then I also wonder, you know, we talked a little bit about the pandemic and how learning has moved online and people working from home.
Yeah.
So maybe they're learning a whole new language and a way of being and connecting with people through digital spaces that are going to be extremely important for them when they work in the future. I study this, and I'm always, as I said, I'm always excited and always like a little bit scared because it's very fascinating. And even though I think there's a lot of potential, I never feel that we should replace all human interaction with these tools. I think it can enhance it. And I think the key part is understanding how it changes us, what are, you know, opportunities and what are risks around that. So I think people still do want to connect with each other. And we just have to decide which ways we think are healthy and contribute to the world in a positive way.
Thank
One
you.
more question, which is really thinking about like who's developing these technologies and how is there work being done around sort of community ownership or, you know, because much of the problem is not with the technology itself, but with like corporate interests and with capitalism, right? And so can you point us to some things that really are thinking about like digital democracy, like VR democracy, and how that might be shaping up?
Yes, I can say this in terms of like the private sector. I know there are definitely some companies, for example, Facebook, Meta, formerly Facebook, they have put calls out for researchers to specifically look at privacy and ethical concerns. What they do with that information, I cannot say. I know they've hired ethicists that have been looking at VR and they have full-time positions. And again, I can't speak to what they decide to do with that information, but I know that they are at least collecting it and at least putting out there to people to think about these questions. I'm not sure, but one of the exciting things that I can say also is that there are a lot of nonprofits that are starting to pop up that are looking at this specifically. Even I know the government sometimes is behind on things what we think about, but they're actually thinking about that. I've been contacted by senators. I've spoken to senators about VR and kids. And so they are thinking about it and they're trying to think about laws and regulations related to this and what are questions and things we need to consider when we're developing new regulations, particularly for kids and virtuality. Again, I don't know when it will happen or what they will be and how that'll affect private industry, but I am encouraged that they are trying to have a conversation and actually try to find some way to implement it if they can.
The media history show another idea because in the history I see the media go over the social boundary. I think the VR, the next market is the porn market, the game market, and they will go over this social boundaries. That's a big market. And well, in my ears, what you say, oh yeah, we are on the good side, and I think on the other side, it's a bigger market.
Yes, again, I think it's one of those particularly for children who has access to it, who doesn't have access to it, something live versus something that is contained. I think that we'll also have to bring up questions about consent when we start thinking about the live experience of interacting with someone in that type of space. And I think technology has moved a lot like that. One could argue that's how VHS tapes and VHS became a huge consumer market was because of pornography. And so it exists and, it didn't define that technology solely. It might've, came from that, maybe part of the market, but, when I was growing up, I was watching The Little Mermaid on my VHS tape. So, I think it is an important thing. And you need to see is this different? Is this different in a good way? And where is that line where it starts to really get complicated? And how can we inform the public effectively about this without them having to learn the hard way about these things?
Hey. Well, thank you, Dr. Bailey.